Essay 7 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 7, Holy Ireland, by Joyce Kilmer. This echo of the AEF is probably the best thing Joyce Kilmer ever wrote, and shows the vein of real tenderness and insight that lay beneath his lively and versatile career on Grub Street. In him, as in many idealists, the Irish theme had become legendary. It was part of his religion and his dream life, and he treated it with real affection and humor. You will find it cropping out many times in his verses. The Irish problem, as it is reflected in this country, is not always clearly understood. Ireland, in the minds of our poets, is a mystical land of green hills, saints and leprechauns, and its political problems are easy. Joyce Kilmer was born in New Brunswick in 1886, studied at Rutgers College and Columbia University, taught school, worked on the staff of the Standard Dictionary, passed through phases of socialism and Anglicanism into the Catholic Communion, and joined the Sunday staff of the New York Times in 1913. He was killed fighting in France in 1918. This sketch is taken from the second of the 3 volumes in which Robert Cortes Holliday, his friend and executor, has collected Joyce Kilmer's work. We had hiked 17 miles that stormy December day, the third of a 4 days' journey. The snow was piled high on our packs, our rifles were crusted with ice, the leather of our hobnailed boots was frozen stiff over our lamed feet. The weary lieutenant led us to the door of a little house in a side street. "Next 12 men," he said. A dozen of us dropped out of the ranks and dragged ourselves over the threshold. We tracked snow and mud over a spotless stone floor. Before an open fire stood Madame and the 3 children, a girl of 8 years, a boy of 5, a boy of 3. They stared with round, frightened eyes at Les Soldats Américains, the first they had ever seen. We were too tired to stare back. We at once climbed to the chill attic, our billet, our lodging for the night. First we lifted the packs from one another's aching shoulders, then, without spreading our blankets, we lay down on the bare boards. For 10 minutes there was silence, broken by an occasional groan, an oath, the striking of a match. Cigarettes glowed like fireflies in a forest. Then a voice came from the corner. "Where is Sergeant Riley?" it said. We lazily searched. There was no Sergeant Riley to be found. "I'll bet the old bum has gone out after a pint," said the voice. And with the curiosity of the American and the enthusiasm of the Irish, we lumbered downstairs in quest of Sergeant Riley. He was sitting on a low bench by the fire. His shoes were off, and his bruised feet were in a pail of cold water. He was too good a soldier to expose them to the heat at once. The little girl was on his lap, and the little boys stood by and envied him. And in a voice that 20 years of soldiering and oceans of whiskey had failed to rob of its Celtic sweetness, he was softly singing, "Ireland isn't Ireland any more." We listened respectfully. "They cheer the King and then salute him," said Sergeant Riley. "A regular Irishman would shoot him," and we all joined in the chorus, "Ireland isn't Ireland any more." "Oh, la la!" exclaimed Madame, and she and all the children began to talk at the top of their voices. What they said, heaven knows, but the tones were friendly, even admiring. "Gentlemen," said Sergeant Riley from his post of honor, "the lady who runs this billet is a very nice lady indeed. She says yez can all take off your shoes and dry your socks by the fire, but take turns and don't crowd or I'll turn yez all upstairs." Now Madame, a woman of some 40 years, was a true bourgeoise, with all the thrift of her class, and by the terms of her agreement with the authorities she was required to let the soldiers have for one night the attic of her house to sleep in, nothing more. No light, no heat. Also, wood is very expensive in France, for reasons that are engraven in letters of blood on the pages of history. Nevertheless, "Asseyez-vous, s'il vous plaît," said Madame, and she brought nearer to the fire all the chairs the establishment possessed, and some chests and boxes to be used as seats; and she and the little girl, whose name was Solange, went out into the snow and came back with heaping armfuls of small logs. The fire blazed merrily, more merrily than it had blazed since August, 1914, perhaps. We surrounded it, and soon the air was thick with steam from our drying socks. Meanwhile, Madame and the sergeant had generously admitted all 11 of us into their conversation. A spirited conversation it was, too, in spite of the fact that she knew no English, and the extent of his French was du pain, du vin, cognac, and bonjour. Those of us who knew a little more of the language of the country acted as interpreters for the others. We learned the names of the children and their ages. We learned that our hostess was a widow. Her husband had fallen in battle just 1 month before our arrival in her home. She showed us with simple pride and affection and restrained grief his picture. Then she showed us those of her 2 brothers, one now fighting at Salonika, the other a prisoner of war, of her mother and father, of herself dressed for First Communion. This last picture she showed somewhat shyly, as if doubting that we would understand it. But when one of us asked in halting French if Solange, her little daughter, had yet made her First Communion, then Madame's face cleared. "Mais oui," she exclaimed, "et vous, ma foi, vous êtes catholique, n'est-ce pas?" At once rosary beads were flourished to prove our right to answer this question affirmatively. Tattered prayer books and somewhat dingy scapulars were brought to light. Madame and the children chattered their surprise and delight to each other, and every exhibit called for a new outburst. "Ah, le bon Saint-Benoît! Et voilà la Conception Immaculée! Oh là là, le Sacré-Cœur!" which last exclamation sounded in no wise as irreverent as it looks in print. Now other treasures, too, were shown, treasures chiefly photographic. There were family groups, there were Coney Island snapshots, and Madame and the children were a gratifyingly appreciative audience. They admired and sympathized, they exclaimed appropriately at the beauty of every girl's face, the tenderness of every pictured mother. We had become the intimates of Madame. She had admitted us into her family, and we her into ours. Soldiers, American soldiers of Irish descent, have souls and hearts. These organs, if the soul may be so termed, had been satisfied; but our stomachs remained, and that they yearned was evident to us. We had made our hike on a meal of hardtack and corned willy. Mess call would sound soon. Should we force our wet shoes on again and plod through the snowy streets to the temporary mess shack? We knew our supply wagons had not succeeded in climbing the last hill into town, and that therefore bread and unsweetened coffee would be our portion. A great depression settled upon us. But Sergeant Reilly rose to the occasion. "Boys," he said, "this here lady has got a good fire going, and I'll bet she can cook. What do you say we get her to fix us up a meal?" The proposal was received joyously at first, then some one said, "But I haven't got any money." "Neither have I, not a damn sou," said another, and again the spiritual temperature of the room fell. Again Sergeant Reilly spoke. "I haven't got any money to speak of meself," he said, "but let's have a showdown. I guess we've got enough to buy somethin' to eat." It was long after pay day, and we were not hopeful of the results of the search. But the wealthy, that is, those who had 2 francs, made up for the poor, that is, those who had 2 sous, and among the coins on the table I noticed an American dime, an English half-crown, and a Chinese piece with a square hole in the center. In negotiable tender the money came in all to 8 francs. It takes more money than that to feed 12 hungry soldiers these days in France, but there was no harm in trying. So an ex-seminarian, an ex-bookkeeper, and an ex-streetcar conductor aided Sergeant Reilly in explaining in French that had both a brogue and a Yankee twang that we were hungry, that this was all the money we had in the world, and that we wanted her to cook us something to eat. Now Madame was what they call in New England a capable woman. In a jiffy she had the money in Solange's hand, and had that admirable child cloaked and wooden shod for the street, and fully informed as to what she was to buy. What Madame and the children had intended to have for supper I do not know, for there was nothing in the kitchen but the fire, the stove, the table, some shelves of dishes, and an enormous bed. Nothing in the way of a food cupboard could be seen, and the only other room of the house was the bare attic. When Solange came back she carried in a basket bigger than herself these articles: 1, 2 loaves of war bread; 2, 5 bottles of red wine; 3, 3 cheeses; 4, numerous potatoes; 5, a lump of fat; 6, a bag of coffee. The whole represented, as was afterward demonstrated, exactly the sum of 10 francs 50 centimes. Well, we all set to work peeling potatoes. Then, with a veritable French trench knife, Madame cut the potatoes into long strips. Meanwhile Solange had put the lump of fat into the big black pot that hung by a chain over the fire. In the boiling grease the potatoes were placed, Madame standing by with a big ladle punched full of holes (I regret that I do not know the technical name for this instrument), and keeping the potato strips swimming, zealously frustrating any attempt on their part to lie lazily at the bottom of the pot. We forgot all about the hike as we sat at supper that evening. The only absentees were the 2 little boys, Michael and Paul. They were really absent only from our board. They were in the room, in the great built-in bed that was later to hold also Madame and Solange. Their little bodies were covered by the 3-foot thick mattress-like red silk quilt, but their tousled heads protruded, and they watched us unblinkingly all the evening. But just as we sat down, before Sergeant Reilly began his task of dishing out the potatoes and starting the bottles on their way, Madame stopped her chattering and looked at Solange, and Solange stopped her chattering and looked at Madame, and they both looked rather searchingly at us. We didn't know what was the matter, but we felt rather embarrassed. Then Madame began to talk, slowly and loudly, as one talks to make foreigners understand. And the gist of her remarks was that she was surprised to see that American Catholics did not say grace before eating like French Catholics. We sprang to our feet at once, but it was not Sergeant Reilly who saved the situation. Instead, the ex-seminarian (he is only temporarily an ex-seminarian; he'll be preaching missions and giving retreats yet if a bit of shrapnel doesn't hasten his journey to heaven) said, after we had blessed ourselves, Benedicite nos equa sumis semper benedict Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. Madame and Solange, obviously relieved, joined us in the Amen, and we sat down again to eat. It was a remarkable feast. There was not much conversation, except on the part of Madame and Solange, but there was plenty of good cheer. Also there was enough cheese and bread and wine and potatoes for all of us, half-starved as we were when we sat down. Even big Considine, who drains a can of condensed milk in a gulp, and has been known to eat an apple pie without stopping to take breath, was satisfied. There were toasts, also, all proposed by Sergeant Reilly. Toasts to Madame, and to the children, and to France, and to the United States, and to the old gray mare. This last toast having an esoteric significance apparent only to Illuminati of Sergeant Reilly's circle. The table cleared, and the Agimus tibi gratias duly said, we sat before the fire, most of us on the floor. We were warm and happy and full of good food and good wine. We spied a slip of paper on the floor by Solange's foot, and unashamedly read it. It was an accounting for the evening's expenditures, totaling exactly 10 francs and 50 centimes. Now, when soldiers are unhappy, during a long, hard hike, for instance, they sing to keep up their spirits. And when they are happy, as on the evening now under consideration, they sing to express their satisfaction with life. We sang "Sweet Rosie O'Grady." We shook the kitchen bedroom with the echoes of "Take Me Back to New York Town." We informed Madame, Solange, Paul, Michael, in fact, the whole village, that we had never been a wanderer and that we longed for our Indiana home. We grew sentimental over Mother Machree, and Sergeant Reilly obliged with a reel in his socks to an accomplishment of whistles and hand-clapping. Now it was our hostess's turn to entertain. We intimated as much. She responded, first by much talk, much consultation with Solange, and finally by going to one of the shelves that held the pans and taking down some paper-covered books. There was more consultation, whispered this time, and much turning of pages. Then, after some preliminary coughing and humming, the music began, the woman's rich alto blending with the child's shrill but sweet notes. And what they sang was "Tantum ergo sacramentum." Why she should have thought that an appropriate song to offer this company of rough soldiers from a distant land I do not know, and why we found it appropriate it is harder still to say. But it did seem appropriate to all of us, to Sergeant Reilly, to Jim, who used to drive a truck, to Larry, who sold cigars, to Frank, who tended a bar on 14th Street. It seemed for some reason eminently fitting. No one of us then or later expressed any surprise that this hymn, familiar to most of us since our mothers first led us to the parish church down the pavements of New York or across the Irish hills, should be sung to us in this strange land and in these strange circumstances. Since the gracious Latin of the church was in order, and since the season was appropriate, one of us suggested Adeste Fideles for the next item on the evening's program. Madame and Solange and our ex-seminarian knew all the words, and the rest of us came in strong with Venite adoremus Dominum. Then, as if to show that piety and mirth may live together, the ladies obliged with Au clair de la lune and other simple ballads of old France; and after taps had sounded in the street outside our door, and there was yawning and wrist-watches were being scanned, the evening's entertainment ended, by general consent, with patriotic selections. We sang, as best we could, the Star-Spangled Banner, Solange and her mother humming the air and applauding at the conclusion. Then we attempted La Marseillaise. Of course we did not know the words. Solange came to our rescue with 2 little pamphlets containing the song, so we looked over each other's shoulders and got to work in earnest. Madame sang with us and Solange, but during the final stanza Madame did not sing. She leaned against the great family bedstead and looked at us. She had taken one of the babies from under the red comforter and held him to her breast. One of her red and toil-scarred hands half covered his fat little back. There was a gentle dignity about that plain, hard-working woman, that soldier's widow. We all felt it, and some of us saw the tears in her eyes. There are mists, faint and beautiful and unchanging, that hang over the green slopes of some mountains I know. I have seen them on the Irish hills, and I have seen them on the hills of France. I think that they are made of the tears of good, brave women. Before I went to sleep that night I exchanged a few words with Sergeant Reilly. We lay side by side on the floor, now piled with straw. Blankets, shelter-halves, slickers, and overcoats ensured warm sleep. Sergeant Reilly's hard old face was wrapped round with his muffler. The final cigarette of the day burned lazily in a corner of his mouth. "That was a pretty good evening, Sarge," I said. "We sure were in luck when we struck this billet." He grunted affirmatively, then puffed in silence for a few minutes. Then he deftly spat the cigarette into a strawless portion of the floor, where it glowed for a few seconds before it went out. "You said it," he remarked. "We were in luck is right. What do you know about that lady, anyway?" "Why," I answered, "I thought she treated us pretty white." "Joe," said Sergeant Reilly, "do you realize how much trouble that woman took to make this bunch of roughnecks comfortable? She didn't make a damn cent on that feed, you know. The kid spent all the money we give her. And she's out about 6 francs for firewood, too. I wish to God I had the money to pay her. I bet she'll go cold for a week now, and hungry, too. And that ain't all," he continued after a pause, broken only by an occasional snore from our blissful neighbors. "Look at the way she cooked them pommes de terre, and fixed things up for us, and let us sit down there with her like we was her family. And look at the way she and the little Sally there sung for us. I tell you, Joe, it makes me think of old times to hear a woman sing them church hymns to me that way. It's 40 years since I heard a hymn sung in a kitchen, and it was my mother, God rest her, that sang them. I sort of realize what we're fighting for now. I never did before. It's for women like that and their kids." It gave me a turn to see her a-sittin' there singing them hymns. I remembered when I was a boy in Shangolden. I wonder if there's many women like that in France now, telling their beads and singing the old hymns and treating poor traveling men the way she's just after treating us. There used to be lots of women like that in the old country, and I think that's why it was called Holy Ireland. End of Essay 7. Essay 8 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 8, A Familiar Preface, by Joseph Conrad. This glorious expression of the credo of all artists, in whatever form of creation, lastingly enriches the English tongue. It is from the Preface to A Personal Record, that fascinating autobiographical volume in which Conrad tells the curious story of a Polish boy who ran away to sea and began to write in English. As a companion piece, those who have the honor of the writer's craft at heart should read Conrad's preface to The Nigger of the Narcissus. All ambitions are lawful except those which climb upward on the miseries or credulities of mankind. Is it permissible to wonder what some newspaper owners, say Mr. Hearst, would reply to that? Mr. Conrad's career is too well known to be annotated here. If by any chance the reader is not acquainted with it, it will be to his soul's advantage to go to a public library and look it up. As a general rule, we do not want much encouragement to talk about ourselves. Yet this little book (footnote, a personal record) Yet this little book is the result of a friendly suggestion, and even of a little friendly pressure. I defended myself with some spirit, but with characteristic tenacity the friendly voice insisted, "You know, you really must." It was not an argument, but I submitted at once. If one must! You perceive the force of a word. He who wants to persuade should put his trust not in the right argument, but in the right word. The power of sound has always been greater than the power of sense. I don't say this by way of disparagement. It is better for mankind to be impressionable than reflective. Nothing humanely great, I mean as affecting a whole mass of lives, has come from reflection. On the other hand, you cannot fail to see the power of mere words, such words as glory, for instance, or pity. I won't mention any more. They are not far to seek. Shouted with perseverance, with ardor, with conviction, these two by their sound alone have set whole nations in motion and upheaved the dry, hard ground on which rests our whole social fabric. There's virtue for you, if you like. Of course the accent must be attended to. The right accent. That's very important. The capacious lung, the thundering, or the tender, vocal cords. Don't talk to me of your Archimedes' lever. He was an absent-minded person with a mathematical imagination. Mathematics commands all my respect, but I have no use for engines. Give me the right word and the right accent, and I will move the world. What a dream for a writer! Because written words have their accent too. Yes! Let me only find the right word. Surely it must be lying somewhere among the wreckage of all the plaints and all the exultations poured out aloud since the first day when hope, the undying, came down on earth. It may be there, close by, disregarded, invisible, quite at hand. But it's no good. I believe there are men who can lay hold of a needle in a pottle of hay at the first try. For myself, I have never had such luck. And then there is that accent. Another difficulty. For who is going to tell whether the accent is right or wrong till the word is shouted, and fails to be heard, perhaps, and goes down wind, leaving the world unmoved? Once upon a time there lived an emperor who was a sage and something of a literary man. He jotted down on ivory tablets thoughts, maxims, reflections, which chance has preserved for the edification of posterity. Among other sayings, I am quoting from memory, I remember this solemn admonition: "Let all thy words have the accent of heroic truth." The accent of heroic truth! That is very fine, but I am thinking that it is an easy matter for an austere emperor to jot down grandiose advice. Most of the working truths on this earth are humble, not heroic. And there have been times in the history of mankind when the accents of heroic truth have moved it to nothing but derision. Nobody will expect to find between the covers of this little book words of extraordinary potency or accents of irresistible heroism. However humiliating for my self-esteem, I must confess that the counsels of Marcus Aurelius are not for me. They are more fit for a moralist than for an artist. Truth of a modest sort I can promise you, and also sincerity. That complete, praiseworthy sincerity which, while it delivers one into the hands of one's enemies, is as likely as not to embroil one with one's friends. Embroil is perhaps too strong an expression. I can't imagine among either my enemies or my friends a being so hard up for something to do as to quarrel with me. To disappoint one's friends would be nearer the mark. Most, almost all, friendships of the writing period of my life have come to me through my books, and I know that a novelist lives in his work. He stands there, the only reality in an invented world, among imaginary things, happenings, and people. Writing about them, he is only writing about himself, but the disclosure is not complete. He remains, to a certain extent, a figure behind the veil, a suspect rather than a seen presence, a movement and a voice behind the draperies of fiction. In these personal notes there is no such veil, and I cannot help thinking of a passage in The Imitation of Christ where the ascetic author, who knew life so profoundly, says that there are persons esteemed on their reputation who by showing themselves destroy the opinion one had of them. This is the danger incurred by an author of fiction who sets out to talk about himself without disguise. While these reminiscent pages were appearing serially, I was remonstrated with for bad economy, as if such writing were a form of self-indulgence, wasting the substance of future volumes. It seems that I am not sufficiently literary. Indeed, a man who never wrote a line for print till he was 36 cannot bring himself to look upon his existence and his experience, upon the sum of his thoughts, sensations, and emotions, upon his memories and his regrets, and the whole possession of his past, as only so much material for his hands. Once before, some years ago, when I published The Mirror of the Sea, a volume of impressions and memories, the same remarks were made to me. Practical remarks. But truth to say, I have never understood the kind of thrift they recommend. I wanted to pay my tribute to the sea, its ships and its men, to whom I remain indebted for so much which has gone to make me what I am. That seemed to me the only shape in which I could offer it to their shades. There could not be a question in my mind of anything else. It is quite possible that I am a bad economist, but it is certain that I am incorrigible. Having matured in the surroundings and under the special conditions of sea life, I have a special piety toward that form of my past, for its impressions were vivid, its appeal direct, its demands such as could be responded to with the natural elation of youth and strength equal to the call. There was nothing in them to perplex a young conscience. Having broken away from my origins under a storm of blame from every quarter which had the merest shadow of right to voice an opinion, removed by great distances from such natural affections as were still left to me, and even estranged, in a measure, from them by the total unintelligible character of the life which had seduced me so mysteriously from my allegiance, I may safely say that, through the blind force of circumstances, the sea was to be all my world, and the merchant service my only home for a long succession of years. No wonder, then, that in my two exclusively sea books, The Nigger of the Narcissus and The Mirror of the Sea, and in the few short sea stories like Youth and Typhoon, I have tried with an almost filial regard to render the vibration of life in the great world of waters in the hearts of the simple men who have for ages traversed its solitudes, and also that something sentient which seems to dwell in ships, the creatures of their hands and the objects of their care. One's literary life must turn frequently for sustenance to memories and seek discourse with the shades, unless one has made up one's mind to write only in order to reprove mankind for what it is, or praise it for what it is not, or generally to teach it how to behave. Being neither quarrelsome, nor a flatterer, nor a sage, I have done none of these things, and I am prepared to put up serenely with the insignificance which attaches to persons who are not meddlesome in some way or other. But resignation is not indifference. I would not like to be left standing as a mere spectator on the bank of the great stream carrying onward so many lives. I would fain claim for myself the faculty of so much insight as can be expressed in a voice of sympathy and compassion. It seems to me that in one, at least, authoritative quarter of criticism I am suspected of a certain unemotional, grim acceptance of facts, of what the French would call sécheresse du cœur. 15 years of unbroken silence before praise or blame testify sufficiently to my respect for criticism, that fine flower of personal expression in the garden of letters. But this is more of a personal matter, reaching the man behind the work, and therefore it may be alluded to in a volume which is a personal note in the margin of the public page. Not that I feel hurt in the least. The charge, if it amounted to a charge at all, was made in the most considerate terms, in a tone of regret. My answer is that if it be true that every novel contains an element of autobiography, and this can hardly be denied, since the creator can only express himself in his creation, then there are some of us to whom an open display of sentiment is repugnant. I would not unduly praise the virtue of restraint. It is often merely temperamental. But it is not always a sign of coldness. It may be pride. There may be nothing more humiliating than to see the shaft of one's emotion miss the mark of either laughter or tears. Nothing more humiliating. And this for the reason that should the mark be missed, should the open display of emotion fail to move, then it must perish unavoidably in disgust or contempt. No artist can be reproached for shrinking from a risk which only fools run to meet and only genius dare confront with impunity. In a task which mainly consists in laying one's soul more or less bare to the world, a regard for decency, even at the cost of success, is but the regard for one's own dignity which is inseparably united with the dignity of one's work. And then, it is very difficult to be wholly joyous or wholly sad on this earth. The comic, when it is human, soon takes upon itself a face of pain; and some of our griefs, some only, not all, for it is the capacity for suffering which makes man august in the eyes of men, have their source in weaknesses which must be recognized with smiling compassion as the common inheritance of us all. Joy and sorrow in this world pass into each other, mingling their forms and their murmurs in the twilight of life as mysterious as an overshadowed ocean, while the dazzling brightness of supreme hopes lies far off, fascinating and still, on the distant edge of the horizon. Yes, I, too, would like to hold the magic wand giving that command over laughter and tears which is declared to be the highest achievement of imaginative literature. Only, to be a great magician, one must surrender oneself to occult and irresponsible powers, either outside or within one's breast. We have all heard of simple men selling their souls for love or power to some grotesque evil. The most ordinary intelligence can perceive without much reflection that anything of the sort is bound to be a fool's bargain. I don't lay claim to particular wisdom because of my dislike and distrust of such transactions. It may be my sea training acting upon a natural disposition to keep good hold on the one thing really mine, but the fact is that I have a positive horror of losing even for one moving moment that full possession of myself which is the first condition of good service. And I have earned my notion of good service from my earlier into my later existence. I, who have never sought in the written word anything else but a form of the beautiful, I have carried over that article of creed from the decks of ships to the more circumscribed space of my desk, and by that act, I suppose, I have become permanently imperfect in the eyes of the ineffable company of pure aesthetes. As in political, so in literary action, a man wins friends for himself mostly by the passion of his prejudices and by the consistent narrowness of his outlook. But I have never been able to love what was not lovable or hate what was not hateful out of deference for some general principle. Whether there be any courage in making this admission I know not. After the middle turn of life's way we consider dangers and joys with a tranquil mind. So I proceed in peace to declare that I have always suspected in the effort to bring into play the extremities of emotions the debasing touch of insincerity. In order to move others deeply we must deliberately allow ourselves to be carried away beyond the bounds of our normal sensibility, innocently enough, perhaps, and of necessity, like an actor who raises his voice on the stage above the pitch of natural conversation, but still we have to do that. And surely this is no great sin. But the danger lies in the writer becoming the victim of his own exaggeration, losing the exact notion of sincerity, and in the end coming to despise truth itself as something too cold, too blunt for his purpose, as, in fact, not good enough for his insistent emotion. From laughter and tears the descent is easy to snivelling and giggles. These may seem selfish considerations, but you can't, in sound morals, condemn a man for taking care of his own integrity. It is his clear duty. And least of all can you condemn an artist pursuing, however humbly and imperfectly, a creative aim. In that interior world where his thought and his emotions go seeking for the experience of imagined adventures, there are no policemen, no law, no pressure of circumstance or dread of opinion to keep him within bounds. Who then is going to say nay to his temptations, if not his conscience? And besides, this, remember, is the place and the moment of perfectly open talk, I think that all ambitions are lawful except those which climb upward on the miseries or credulities of mankind. All intellectual and artistic ambitions are permissible up to and even beyond the limit of prudent sanity. They can hurt no one. If they are mad, then so much the worse for the artist. Indeed, as virtue is said to be, such ambitions are their own reward. Is it such a very mad presumption to believe in the sovereign power of one's art, to try for other means, for other ways of affirming this belief in the deeper appeal of one's work? To try to go deeper is not to be insensible. A historian of hearts is not a historian of emotions, yet he penetrates further, restrained as he may be, since his aim is to reach the wry fount of laughter and tears. The sight of human affairs deserves admiration and pity; they are worthy of respect, too, and he is not insensible who pays them the undemonstrative tribute of a sigh which is not a sob, and of a smile which is not a grin. Resignation, not mystic, not detached, but resignation, open-eyed, conscious, and informed by love, is the only one of our feelings for which it is impossible to become a sham. Not that I think resignation the last word of wisdom. I am too much the creature of my time for that. But I think that the proper wisdom is to will what the gods will, without, perhaps, being certain what their will is, or even if they have a will of their own. And in this matter of life and art it is not the why that matters so much to our happiness as the how. As the Frenchman said, "Il y a toujours la manière." Very true. Yes, there is the manner. The manner is laughter, in tears, in irony, in indignations and enthusiasms, in judgments, and even in love. The manner in which, as in the features and character of a human face, the inner truth is foreshadowed for those who know how to look at their kind. Those who read me know my conviction that the world, the temporal world, rests on a few very simple ideas, so simple that they must be as old as the hills. It rests notably, among others, on the idea of fidelity. At a time when nothing which is not revolutionary in some way or other can expect to attract much attention, I have not been revolutionary in my writings. The revolutionary spirit is mighty convenient in this, that it free one from all scruples as regards ideas. Its hard, absolute optimism is repulsive to my mind by the menace of fanaticism and intolerance it contains. No doubt one should smile at these things, but, imperfect aesthete, I am no better philosopher. All claim to special righteousness awakens in me that scorn and anger from which a philosophical mind should be free. End of Essay 8. Essay 9 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 9, On Drawing, by A. P. Herbert. A. P. Herbert is one of the most brilliant of the younger English writers, and has done remarkable work in fields apparently incompatible: light verse, humorous drolleries, and a beautiful written tragic novel, The Secret Battle. This last was unquestionably one of the most powerful books born of the war, but its sale was tragically small. The House by the River, a later book, was also an amazingly competent and original tale, apparently cast along the lines of the conventional mystery story, but really a study of selfishness and cowardice done with startling irony and intensity. Mr. Herbert went to Winchester School and New College, Oxford, where he took his degree in 1914. He saw military service at the Dardanelles and in France, and is now on the staff of Punch. There is no young writer in England from whom one may more confidently expect a continuance of fine work. This airy and delicious little absurdity is a perfect example of what a genuine humorist can do. If there is still any one in doubt as to the value of the old-fashioned classical training in forming a lusty prose style, let him examine Mr. Herbert's The Secret Battle. This book often sounds oddly like a translation from vigorous Greek, e.g. Herodotus. It is lucid, compact, logical, rich in telling epithet, informal and swift. If these are not the cardinal prose virtues, what are? It is commonly said that everybody can sing in the bathroom, and this is true. Singing is very easy. Drawing, though, is much more difficult. I have devoted a good deal of time to drawing, one way and another. I have to attend a great many committees and public meetings, and at such functions I find that drawing is almost the only art one can satisfactorily pursue during the speeches. One really cannot sing during the speeches, so as a rule I draw. I do not say that I am an expert yet, but after a few more meetings I calculate that I shall know drawing as well as it can be known. The first thing, of course, is to get on to a really good committee, and by a good committee I mean a committee that provides decent materials. An ordinary departmental committee is no use. Generally they only give you a couple of pages of lined foolscap and no white blotting paper, and very often the pencils are quite soft. White blotting paper is essential. I know of no material the spoiling of which gives so much artistic pleasure, except perhaps snow. Indeed, if I was asked to choose between making pencil marks on a sheet of white blotting paper and making footmarks on a sheet of white snow, I should be in a thingummy. Much the best committees from the point of view of material are committees about business which meet at business premises, shipping offices for choice. One of the Pacific lines has the best white blotting paper I know, and the pencils there are a dream. I am sure the directors of that firm are drawers, for they always give you two pencils, one hard for doing noses and one soft for doing hair. When you have selected your committee and the speeches are well away, the drawing begins. Much the best thing to draw is a man, not the chairman or Lord Pommery Quint or any member of the committee, but just a man. Many novices make the mistake of selecting a subject for their art before they begin. Usually they select the chairman, and when they find it is more like Mr. Gladstone they are discouraged. If they had waited a little, it could have been Mr. Gladstone officially. As a rule, I begin with the forehead and work down to the chin. Figure 1. When I have done the outline, I put in the eye. This is one of the most difficult parts of the drawing. One is never quite sure where the eye goes. If, however, it is not a good eye, a useful tip is to give the man spectacles. This generally makes him a clergyman, but it helps the eye. Figure 2. Now you have to outline the rest of the head, and this is rather a gamble. Personally, I go for strong heads. Figure 3. I am afraid it is not a strong neck. I expect he is an author, and is not well fed, but that is the worst of strong heads. They make it so difficult to join up the chin and the back of the neck. The next thing to do is to put in the ear, and once you have done this, the rest is easy. Ears are much more difficult than eyes. Figure 4. I hope that is right. It seems to me to be a little too far to the southward. But it is done now, and once you have put in the ear, you can't go back, not unless you are on a very good committee, which provides India rubber as well as pencils. Now I do the hair. Hair may either be very fuzzy, or black, or lightish and thin. It depends chiefly on what sort of pencils are provided. For myself, I prefer black hair, because then the parting shows up better. Figure 5. Until one draws hair, one never realizes what large heads people have. Doing the hair takes the whole of a speech, usually, even one of the chairman's speeches. This is not one of my best men. I am sure the ear is in the wrong place, and I am inclined to think he ought to have spectacles. Only then he would be a clergyman, and I have decided that he is Mr. Philip Gibbs at the age of 20, so he must carry on with his eye as it is. I find that all my best men face to the west. It is a curious thing. Sometimes I draw two men facing each other, but the one facing east is always a dud. There, you see. Figure 6. The one on the right is a Bolshevik. He has a low forehead and beetling brows, a most unpleasant man. Yet he has a powerful face. The one on the left was meant to be another Bolshevik, arguing with him. But he has turned out to be a lady, so I have had to give her a bun. She is a lady solicitor, but I don't know how she came to be talking to the Bolshevik. When you have learned how to do men, the only other things in drawing are perspective and landscape. Perspective is great fun. The best thing to do is a long French road with telegraph poles. Fig. 7. I have put in a fence as well. Landscape is chiefly composed of hills and trees. Trees are the most amusing, especially fluffy trees. Here is a landscape. Fig. 8. Somehow or other a man has got into this landscape, and as luck would have it, it is Napoleon. Apart from this, it is not a bad landscape. But it takes a very long speech to get an ambitious piece of work like this through. There is one other thing I ought to have said. Never attempt to draw a man front face. It can't be done. End of Essay 9. Essay 10 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 10, O. Henry, by O. W. Firkins. Several years ago I turned to Who's Who in America in hope of finding some information about O. W. Firkins, whose brilliant reviews, chiefly of poetry, were appearing in The Nation. I found no entry, but every few months I would again rummage that stout red volume with the same intention, forgetting that I had done so before without success. It seemed hardly creditable that a critic so brilliant had been overlooked by the industrious compilers of that work, which includes hundreds of hacks and four-flushers. When gathering the contents of this book, I tried Who's Who again. Still without result, I wrote to Mr. Firkins pleading for biographical details. Modestly but firmly he denied me. So all I can tell you is this, that Mr. Firkins is to my mind one of the half-dozen most sparkling critics in this country. One sometimes feels that he is carried a little past his destination by the sheer gusto and hilarity of his antitheses and paradoxes. That is not so, however, in this essay about O. Henry, an author who has often been grotesquely mispraised, I did not say overpraised, by people incompetent to appreciate his true greatness. Mr. Robert Cortes Holliday, in an essay called The Amazing Failure of O. Henry, said that O. Henry created no memorable characters. Mr. Firkins suggests the obvious but satisfying answer. New York itself is his triumph. The New York of O. Henry, already almost erased physically, remains a personality and an identity. Mr. Firkins is professor of English at the University of Minnesota and a contributing editor of the Weekly Review, in which this essay first appeared in September 1919. The footnotes are, of course, his own. There are two opinions concerning O. Henry. The middle class views him as the impersonation of vigor and brilliancy. Part of the higher criticism sees in him little but sensation and persiflage. Between these views there is a natural relation. The gods of the heathens are ipso facto the demons of Christianity. Unmixed assertions, however, are commonly mixtures of truth and falsehood. There is room today for an estimate which shall respect both opinions and adopt neither. There is one literary trait in which I am unable to name any writer of tales in any literature who surpasses O. Henry. Footnote: William Sidney Porter, 1862-1910, son of Algernon Sidney Porter, physician, was born, bred, and meagerly educated in Greensboro, North Carolina. In Greensboro he was drug clerk. In Texas he was amateur ranchman, land office clerk, editor, and bank teller. Convicted of misuse of bank funds on insufficient evidence, which he supplemented by the insanity of flight, he passed 3 years and 3 months in the Ohio State Penitentiary at Columbus. Release was the prelude to life in New York, to story writing, to rapid and widespread fame. Latterly his stories, published in New York journals and in book form, were consumed by the public with an avidity which his premature death in 1910 scarcely checked. The pen name, O. Henry, is almost certainly borrowed from a French chemist, Etienne Ossian Henry, whose abridged name he fell upon in his pharmacal researches. See the interesting O. Henry biography by C. Alphonso Smith. It is not primary or even secondary among literary merits. It is less a value per se than the condition or foundation of values. But its utility is manifest, and it is rare among men. Chaucer and Shakespeare prove the possibility of its absence in masters of that very branch of art in which its presence would seem to be imperative. I refer to the designing of stories, not to the primary intuition or to skill in development, in both of which finer phases of invention O. Henry has been largely and frequently surpassed, but to the disposition of masses, to the blocking out of plots. That a half-educated American provincial should have been original in a field in which original men have been copyists is enough of itself to make his personality observable. Illustration, even of conceded truths, is rarely superfluous. I supply 2 instances. 2 lads, parting in New York, agree to meet after 20 years at a specified hour, date, and corner. Both are faithful, but the years in which their relation has slept in mutual silence and ignorance have turned the one into a dashing criminal, the other into a sober officer of the law. Behind the picturesque and captivating rendezvous lurks a powerful dramatic situation and a moral problem of arresting gravity. This is dealt with in 6 pages of The 4,000,000. The furnished room, 2 stories further on, occupies 12 pages. Through the wilderness of apartments on the Lower West Side a man trails a woman. Chance leads him to the very room in which the woman ended her life the week before. Between him and the truth the avarice of a sordid landlady interposes the curtain of a lie. In the bed in which the girl slept and died the man sleeps and dies, and the entrance of the deadly fumes into his nostrils shuts the sinister and mournful coincidence forever from the knowledge of mankind. O. Henry gave these tales neither extension nor prominence. So far as I know, they were received without bravos or salvos. The distinction of a body of work in which such specimens are undistinguished hardly requires comment. A few types among these stories may be specified. There are the Sidney Cartonisms, defined in the name. Love stories in which divided hearts or simply divided persons are brought together by the strategy of chance. Hoax stories, deft pictures of smiling roguery. Prince and pauper stories, in which wealth and poverty face each other, sometimes enact each other. Disguise stories, in which the wrong clothes often draw the wrong bullets. Complemental stories, in which Jim sacrifices his beloved watch to buy combs for Delia, who meanwhile has sacrificed her beloved hair to buy a chain for Jim. This imperfect list is eloquent in its way. It smooths our path to the assertion that O. Henry's specialty is the enlistment of original method in the service of traditional appeals. The ends are the ends of 50 years ago. O. Henry transports us by aeroplane to the old homestead. O. Henry's stories have been known to coincide with earlier work in a fashion which dims the novelty of the tale without clouding the originality of the author. I thought the brilliant Harlem tragedy, in The Trimmed Lamp, unique through sheer audacity, but the other day I found its motive repeated with singular exactness in Montesquieu's Lettres Paysannes. Criticism of O. Henry falls into those superlatives and antitheses in which his own faculty delighted. In mechanical invention he is almost the leader of his race. In a related quality, a defect, his leadership is even more conspicuous. I doubt if the sense of the probable, or more precisely of the available in the improbable, ever became equally weakened or deadened in a man who made his living by its exercise. The improbable, even the impossible, has its place in art, though that place is relatively low, and it is curious that works such as the Arabian Nights and Grimm's Fairy Tales, whose stock in trade is the incredible, are the works which give almost no trouble on the score of verisimilitude. The truth is that we reject not what it is impossible to prove, or even what it is possible to disprove, but what it is impossible to imagine. O. Henry asks us to imagine the unimaginable. That is his crime. The right and wrong improbabilities may be illustrated from two burglar stories. Sixes and Sevens contains an excellent tale of a burglar and a citizen who fraternize in a comic midnight interview on the score of their common sufferings from rheumatism. This feeling, in practice, would not triumph over fear and greed, but the feeling is natural, and everybody with a grain of nature in him can imagine its triumph. Nature tends towards that impossibility, and art, lifting, so to speak, the lid which fact drops upon nature, reveals nature in belying fact. In another story, in Whirligigs, a nocturnal interview takes place in which a burglar and a small boy discuss the etiquette of their mutual relation by formulas derived from short stories with which both are amazingly conversant. This is the wrong use of the improbable. Even an imagination inured to the virtues of burglars and the maturity of small boys will have naught to do with this insanity. But O. Henry can go further yet. There are inventions in his tales the very utterance of which, not the mere substance, but the utterance, on the part of a man not writing from Bedlam or for Bedlam, impresses the reader as incredible. In A Comedy in Rubber, two persons become so used to spectatorship at transactions in the street that they drift into the part of spectators when the transaction is their own wedding. Can human daring or human folly go further? O. Henry is on the spot to prove that they can. In The Romance of a Busy Broker, a busy and forgetful man in a freak of absent-mindedness offers his hand to the stenographer whom he had married the night before. The other day in the Journal of the Goncourt I came upon the following sentence: "Never will the imagination approach the improbabilities and the antitheses of truth." 2:9. This is dated February 21, 1862. Truth had still the advantage. O. Henry was not born till September of the same year. Passing on to style, we are still in the land of antithesis. The style is gross and fine. Of the plenitude of its stimulus there can be no question. In Sixes and Sevens a young man sinking under accidental morphia is kept awake and alive by shouts, kicks, and blows. O. Henry's public seems imaged in that young man. But I draw a sharp distinction between the tone of the style and its pattern. The tone is brazen, or better perhaps brassy. Its self-advertisement is incorrigible. It reeks with that air of performance which is opposed to real efficiency. But the pattern is another matter. The South rounds its periods like its vowels. O. Henry has read, not widely, but wisely, in his boyhood. His sentences are built, a rare thing in the best writers of today. In conciseness, that Spartan virtue, he was strong, though it must be confessed that the tale-teller was now and then hustled from the rostrum by his rival and enemy, the talker. He can introduce a felicity with a noiselessness that numbers him for a flying second among the sovereigns of English. In one of the second-floor front windows Mrs. McCaskey awaited her husband. Supper was cooling on the table. Its heat went into Mrs. McCaskey. I regret the tomfoolery. I wince at the slang. Yet even for these levities, with which his pages are so liberally besprinkled or bedaubed, some half-apology may be circumspectly urged. In nonsense his ease is consummate. A horseman who should dismount to pick up a bauble would be childish. O. Henry picks it up without dismounting. Slang, again, is most pardonable in the man with whom its use is least exclusive and least necessary. There are men who, going for a walk, take their dogs with them. There are other men who give a walk to their dogs. Substitute slang for the dog, and the superiority of the first class to the second will exactly illustrate the superiority of O. Henry to the abject traffickers in slang. In the Pendulum, Katie has a new patch in her crazy quilt, which the Iceman cut from the end of his four-in-hand. In The Day We Celebrate, threading the mazes of a banana grove is compared to paging the palm room of a New York hotel for a man named Smith. O. Henry's is the type of mind to which images like this four-in-hand and this palm room are presented in exhaustless abundance and unflagging continuity. There was hardly an object in the merry-go-round of civilized life that had not offered at least an end or an edge to the avidity of his consuming eyes. Nothing escapes from the besom of his allusiveness, and the style is streaked and pied almost to monotony by the accumulation of lively details. If O. Henry's style was crude, it was also rare. But it is part of the grimness of the bargain that destiny drives with us that the mixture of the crude and the rare should be a crude mixture, as the sons of whites and negroes are numbered with the blacks. In the kingdom of style, O. Henry's estates were princely, but to pay his debts he must have sold them all. Thus far in our inquiry, extraordinary merits have been offset by extraordinary defects. To lift our author out of the class of brilliant and skilful entertainers, more is needed. Is more forthcoming? I should answer yes. In O. Henry, above the knowledge of settings which is clear and first-hand, but subsidiary, above the order of events, which is generally speaking fantastic, above the emotions, which are sound and warm, but almost purely derivative, there is a rather small but impressive body of first-hand perspicacities and reactions. On these his endurance may hinge. I name first of all O. Henry's feeling for New York. With the exception of his New Orleans, I care little for his South and West, which are a boyish South and West, and as little or even less for his Spanish-American communities. My objection to his opera buffa republics is not that they are inadequate as republics, for that we are entirely prepared, but that they are inadequate as opera. He lets us see his show from the coulisses. The pretense lacks standing even among pretenses, and a faith must be induced before its removal can enliven us. But his New York has quality. It is the family of Dickens' London and Hugo's Paris, though it is plainly a cadet in the family. Mr. Howells, in his profound and valuable study of the metropolis in A Hazard of New Fortunes, is penetrating. O. Henry, on the other hand, is penetrated. His New York is intimate and clinging. It is caught in the mesh of the imagination. O. Henry had rare but precious insights into human destiny and human nature. In these pictures he is not formally accurate. He could never, or seldom, set his truth before us in that moderation and proportion which truths acquire in the stringencies of actuality. He was apt to present his insight in a sort of parable or allegory, to upraise it before the eyes of mankind on the mast or flagpole of some vehement exaggeration. Epigram shows us truth in the embrace of a lie, and tales which are dramatized epigrams are subject to a like constraint. The force, however, is real. I could scarcely name anywhere a more powerful exposition of fatality than Roads of Destiny, the initial story in the volume which appropriates its title. It wanted only the skilful romantic touch of a Gautier or Stevenson to enroll this tale among the masterpieces of its kind in contemporary letters. Now and then the ingredient of parable is hardly perceptible. We draw close to the bare fact. O. Henry, fortunate in plots, is peculiarly fortunate in his renunciation of plot. If contrivance is lucrative, it is also costly. There is an admirable little story called The Pendulum (in The Trimmed Lamp) the simplicity of whose fable would have satisfied Coupé or Hawthorne. A man in a flat, by force of custom, has come to regard his wife as a piece of furniture. She departs for a few hours, and by the break in usage is restored, in his consciousness, to womanhood. She comes back and relapses into furniture. That is all. O. Henry could not have given us less, or more. Farcical, clownish, if you will, the story resembles those clowns who carry daggers under their motley. When John Perkins takes up that inauspicious hat, the reader smiles and quails. I will mention a few other examples of insights, with the proviso that they are not specially commended to the man whose quest in the short story is the electrifying or the calorific. They include the social triangle, the making of a New Yorker, and the foreign policy of Company 99, all in The Trimmed Lamp, the brief debut of Tildy in The 4,000,000, and the complete life of John Hopkins in The Voice of the City. I cannot close this summary of good points without a passing reference to the not unsuggestive portrayal of humane and cheerful scoundrels in The Gentle Grafter. The picture, if false to species, is faithful to genus. O. Henry's egregiousness on the superficial side, both in merits and defects, reminds us of those park benches so characteristic of his tales, which are occupied by a millionaire at one end and a mendicant at the other. But to complete the image we must add as a casual visitor to that bench a seer or a student who, sitting down between the previous comers and suspending the flamboyancies of their dialogue, should gaze with the pensive eye of Goldsmith or Addison upon the passing crowd. In O. Henry, American journalism and the Victorian tradition meet. His mind, quick to don the guise of modernity, was impervious to its spirit. The specifically modern movements, the scientific awakening, the religious upheaval and subsidence, the socialistic gospel, the enfranchisement of women, these never interfered with his artless and joyous pursuit of the old romantic motives of love, hate, wealth, poverty, gentility, disguise, and crime. On two points a moral record which, in his literature, is everywhere sound and stainless, rises almost to nobility. In an age when sexual excitement had become available and permissible, this worshipper of stimulus never touched with so much as a finger-tip that insidious and meretricious fruit. The second point is his feeling for underpaid working girls. His passionate concern for this wrong derives a peculiar emphasis from the general refusal of his books to bestow countenance or notice on philanthropy in its collective forms. When, in his dream of heaven, he is asked, "Are you one of the bunch?" meaning one of the bunch of grasping and grinding employers, the response, through all its slang, is soul-stirring. "Not on your immortality," said I. "I'm only the fellow that set fire to an orphan asylum and murdered a blind man for his pennies." The author of that retort may have some difficulty with the sentries that watch the entrance of Parnassus. He will have none with the gatekeeper of the New Jerusalem. End of Essay 10. Essay 11 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 11, The Mowing of a Field, by Hilaire Belloc. We have not had in our time a more natural-born essayist of the scampering sort than Hilaire Belloc. He is an infectious fellow. If you read him much, you will find yourself trying to imitate him. There is no harm in doing so. He himself caught the trick from Rabelais. I do not propose to rehash here the essay I wrote about him in a book called Shandygaff. You can refer to it there, which will be good business all round. I know it is a worthy essay, for much of it was cribbed from an article by Mr. Thomas Seccombe, which an American paper lifted from the English journal, which presumably paid Mr. Seccombe for it. I wrote it for the Boston Transcript, where I knew the theft would be undetected, and in shoveling together some stuff for a book (that was in 1917, the cost of living was rising at an angle of 45 degrees, as so many graphs have shown), I put it in, forgetting, until too late, that some of it was absolute plunder. Mr. Chesterton once said something like this: "It is a mistake to think that thieves do not respect property. They only wish it to become their property, so that they may more perfectly respect it." And, by the way, Max Beerbohm's parody of Belloc in A Christmas Garland is something not to be missed. It is one of the best proofs that Belloc is a really great artist. Beerbohm does not waste his time mimicking the small fry. Hilaire Belloc, son of a French father and an English mother, his happy junction of both English and French genius in prose is hereditary, was born in France in 1870. He lived in Sussex as a child, served in the French Field Artillery, was at Balliol College, Oxford, 1893–95, and sat 4 years, 1906–10, in the House of Commons. Certainly you must read, among his gatherings of essays, On Nothing, On Everything, On Something, Hills and the Sea, First and Last. Then you can read The Path to Rome, and The Four Men, and Caliban's Guide to Letters, and The Pyrenees, and Marie Antoinette. If you desire the bouillon of his charm, there is A Picked Company, a selection by Mr. E. V. Lucas of his most representative work. It is published by Methuen and Company, 36 Essex Street, W.C., London. Having done so, come again. We will go off in a corner and talk about Mr. Belloc. There is a valley in South England, remote from ambition and from fear, where the passage of strangers is rare and unperceived, and where the scent of the grass in summer is breathed only by those who are native to that unvisited land. The roads to the Channel do not traverse it. They choose upon either side easier passes over the range. One track alone leads up through it to the hills, and this is changeable. Now green where men have little occasion to go, now a good road where it nears the homesteads and the barns. The woods grow steep above the slopes, they reach sometimes the very summit of the heights, or, when they cannot attain them, fill in and clothe the coombes. And in between, along the floor of the valley, deep pastures and their silence are bordered by lawns of chalky grass and the small yew trees of the downs. The clouds that visit its sky reveal themselves beyond the one great rise, and sail, white and enormous, to the other, and sink beyond that other. But the plains above which they have traveled, and the weald to which they go, the people of the valley cannot see and hardly recall. The wind, when it reaches such fields, is no longer a gale from the salt, but fruitful and soft, an inland breeze. And those whose blood was nourished here feel in that wind the fruitfulness of our orchards and all the life that all things draw from the air. In this place, when I was a boy, I pushed through a fringe of beeches that made a complete screen between me and the world, and I came to a glade called No Man's Land. I climbed beyond it, and I was surprised and glad, because from the ridge of that glade I saw the sea. To this place very lately I returned. The many things that I recovered as I came up the countryside were not less charming than when a distant memory had enshrined them, but much more. Whatever veil is thrown by a longing recollection had not intensified nor even made more mysterious the beauty of that happy ground. Not in my very dreams of morning had I, in exile, seen it more beloved or more rare. Much also that I had forgotten now returned to me as I approached: a group of elms, a little turn of the parson's wall, a small paddock beyond the graveyard close, cherished by one man, with a low wall of very old stone guarding it all around. and all these things fulfilled and amplified my delight, till even the good vision of the place, which I had kept so many years, left me and was replaced by its better reality. Here, I said to myself, is a symbol of what some say is reserved for the soul, pleasure of a kind which cannot be imagined save in a moment when at last it is attained. When I came to my own gate and my own field, and had before me the house I knew, I looked around a little, though it was already evening, and I saw that the grass was standing as it should stand when it is ready for the scythe. For in this, as in everything that a man can do, of those things at least which are very old, there is an exact moment when they are done best, and it has been remarked of whatever rules us that it works blunderingly, seeing that the good things given to a man are not given at the precise moment when they would have filled him with delight. But whether this is true or false, we can choose the just turn of the season in everything we do of our own will, and especially in the making of hay. Many think that hay is best made when the grass is thickest, and so they delay until it is rank and in flower, and has already heavily pulled the ground. And there is another false reason for delay, which is wet weather. For very few will understand, though it comes year after year, that we have rain always in South England between the sickle and the scythe, or, say, just after the weeks of east wind are over. First we have a week of sudden warmth, as though the South had come to see us all. Then we have the weeks of east and southeast wind, and then we have more or less of that rain of which I spoke, and which always astonishes the world. Now it is just before, or during, or at the very end of that rain, but not later, that grass should be cut for hay. True, upland grass, which is always thin, should be cut earlier than the grass in the bottoms and along the water meadows. But not even the latest, even in the wettest seasons, should be left as it is, to flower and even to seed. For what we get when we store our grass is not a harvest of something ripe, but a thing just caught in its prime before maturity. As witness that our corn and straw are best yellow, but our hay is best green. So also death should be represented with a scythe, and time with a sickle. For time can take only what is ripe, but death comes always too soon. In a word, then, it is always much easier to cut grass too late than too early, and I, under that evening, and come back to these pleasant fields, looked at the grass and knew that it was time. June was in full advance. It was the beginning of that season when the night has already lost her foothold of the earth and hovers over it, never quite descending, but mixing sunset with the dawn. Next morning, before it was yet broad day, I awoke and thought of the mowing. The birds were already chattering in the trees beside my window, all except the nightingale, which had left and flown away to the weald, where he sings all summer by day as well as by night in the oaks and the hazel spinneys, and especially along the little river Adur, one of the rivers of the weald. The birds and the thought of the mowing had awakened me, and I went down the stairs and along the stone floors to where I could find a scythe, and when I took it from its nail I remembered how, 14 years ago, I had last gone out with my scythe, just so, into the fields at morning. In between that day and this were many things, cities and armies, and a confusion of books, mountains and the desert, and horrible great breadths of sea. When I got out into the long grass the sun was not yet risen, but there were already many colors in the eastern sky, and I made haste to sharpen my scythe, so that I might get to the cutting before the dew should dry. Some say that it is best to wait till all the dew has risen, so as to get the grass quite dry from the very first. But though it is an advantage to get the grass quite dry, yet it is not worth while to wait till the dew has risen. For in the first place you lose many hours of work, and those the coolest, and next, which is more important, you lose that great ease and thickness in cutting which comes of the dew. So I at once began to sharpen my scythe. There is an art also in the sharpening of the scythe, and it is worth describing carefully. Your blade must be dry, and that is why you will see men rubbing the scythe blade with grass before they whet it. Then also your rubber must be quite dry, and on this account it is a good thing to lay it on your coat and keep it there during all your day's mowing. The scythe you stand upright, with the blade pointing away from you, and you put your left hand firmly on the back of the blade, grasping it. Then you pass the rubber first down one side of the blade edge and then down the other, beginning near the handle and going on to the point and working quickly and hard. When you first do this you will perhaps cut your hand, but it is only at first that such an accident will happen to you. To tell when the scythe is sharp enough, this is the rule. First the stone clangs and grinds against the iron harshly, then it rings musically to one note. Then at last it purrs as though the iron and stone were exactly suited. When you hear this, your scythe is sharp enough, and I, when I heard it that June dawn, with everything quite silent except the birds, let down the scythe and bent myself to mow. When one does anything anew, after so many years, one fears very much for one's trick or habit. But all things once learnt are easily recoverable, and I very soon discovered the swing and power of the mower. Mowing well and mowing badly, or rather not mowing at all, are separated by very little, as is also true of writing verse, of playing the fiddle, and of dozens of other things, but of nothing more than of believing. For the bad or young or untaught mower, without tradition, the mower Promethean, the mower original and contemptuous of the past, does all these things. He leaves great crescents of grass uncut. He digs the point of the scythe hard into the ground with a jerk. He loosens the handle and even the fastenings of the blade. He twists the blade with his blunders, and he blunts the blade. He chips it, dulls it, or breaks it clean off at the tip. If anyone is standing by, he cuts him in the ankle. He sweeps up into the air wildly, with nothing to resist his stroke. He drags up earth with the grass, which is like making the meadow bleed. But the good mower, who does things just as they should be done and have been for 100,000 years, falls into none of these fooleries. He goes forward very steadily, his scythe blade just barely missing the ground, every grass falling. The swish and rhythm of his mowing are always the same. So great an art can only be learnt by continual practice, but this much is worth writing down, that, as in all good work, to know the thing with which you work is the core of the affair. Good verse is best written on good paper with an easy pen, not with a lump of coal on a whitewashed wall. The pen thinks for you, and so does the scythe mow for you, if you treat it honorably and in a manner that makes it recognize its service. The manner is this: you must regard the scythe as a pendulum that swings, not as a knife that cuts. A good mower puts no more strength into his stroke than into his lifting. Again, stand up to your work. The bad mower, eager and full of pain, leans forward and tries to force the scythe through the grass. The good mower, serene and able, stands as nearly straight as the shape of the scythe will let him, and follows up every stroke closely, moving his left foot forward. Then also let every stroke get well away. Mowing is a thing of ample gestures, like drawing a cartoon. Then again, get yourself into a mechanical and repetitive mood. Be thinking of anything at all but your mowing, and be anxious only when there seems some interruption to the monotony of the sound. In this, mowing should be like one's prayers, all of a sort and always the same, and so made that you can establish a monotony and work them, as it were, with half your mind. That happier half, the half that does not bother. In this way, when I had recovered the art after so many years, I went forward over the field, cutting lane after lane through the grass, and bringing out its most secret essences with the sweep of the scythe, until the air was full of odours. At the end of every lane I sharpened my scythe and looked back at the work done, and then carried my scythe down again upon my shoulder to begin another. So, long before the bell rang in the chapel above me, that is, long before 6 o'clock, which is the time for the Angelus, I had many swathes already lying in order parallel like soldiery, and the high grass yet standing, making a great contrast with the shaven part, looked dense and high, as it says in the ballad of Valedun, where "the tall son of the seven winds came riding out of the hitherbythe, and his horse hoofs, you will remember, trampled into the press and made a gap in it, and his sword, as you know, was like a scythe in Arcus when the grass is high and all the swathes in order lie, and there's the bailiff standing by, a gathering of the tithe." So I mowed all that morning till the houses awoke in the valley, and from some of them rose a little fragrant smoke, and men began to be seen. I stood still and rested on my scythe to watch the wakening of the village, when I saw coming up to my field a man whom I had known in older times before I had left the valley. He was of that dark, silent race upon which all the learned quarrel, but which, by whatever meaningless name it may be called, Iberian or Celtic or what you will, is the permanent root of all England, and makes England wealthy and preserves it everywhere, except perhaps in the fens and in a part of Yorkshire. Everywhere else you will find it active and strong. These people are intensive. Their thoughts and their labours turn inward. It is on account of their presence in these islands that our gardens are the richest in the world. They also love low rooms and ample fires and great warm slopes of thatch. They have, as I believe, an older acquaintance with the English air than any other of all the strains that make up England. They hunted in the weald with stones, and camped in the pines of the green sand. They lurked under the oaks of the upper rivers, and saw the legionaries go up the straight paved road from the sea. They helped the few pirates to destroy the towns, and mixed with those pirates, and shared the spoils of the Roman villas, and were glad to see the captains and the priests destroyed. They remain, and no admixture of the Frisian pirates, or the Breton, or the Angevin and Norman conquerors has very much affected their cunning eyes. To this race, I say, belonged the man who now approached me, and he said to me, "Mowing?" And I answered, "Ar." Then he said, "Ar," as in duty bound, for so we speak to each other in the steans of the Downs. Next he told me that, as he had nothing to do, he would lend me a hand, and I thanked him warmly, or, as we say, kindly; for it is a good custom of ours always to treat bargaining as though it were a courteous pastime. And though what he was after was money, and what I wanted was his labour at the least pay, yet we both played the comedy that we were free men, the one granting a grace and the other accepting it. For the dry bones of commerce, avarice, and method and need are odious to the valley, and we cover them up with a pretty body of fiction and observance. Thus, when it comes to buying pigs, the buyer does not begin to decry the pig, and the vendor to praise it, as is the custom with lesser men, but tradition makes them do business in this fashion. First, the buyer will go up to the seller when he sees him in his own steading, and looking at the pig with admiration, the buyer will say that rain may or may not fall, or that we shall have snow or thunder, according to the time of the year. Then the seller, looking critically at the pig, will agree that the weather is as his friend maintains. There is no haste at all. Great leisure marks the dignity of their exchange. And the next step is, that the buyer says, "That's a fine pig you have there, Mr. Blank," giving the seller's name. "Ar, a powerful fine pig." Then the seller, saying also "Mr." (for twin brothers rocked in one cradle give each other ceremonious observance here), The seller, I say, admits, as though with reluctance, the strength and beauty of the pig, and falls into deep thought. Then the buyer says, as though moved by a great desire, that he is ready to give so much for the pig, naming half the proper price, or a little less. Then the seller remains in silence for some moments, and at last begins to shake his head slowly till he says, "I don't be thinking o' selling the pig anyways." He will also add that a party only Wednesday offered him so much for the pig, and he names about double the proper price. Thus all ritual is duly accomplished, and the solemn act is entered upon with reverence and in a spirit of truth. For when the buyer uses this phrase, "I'll tell you what I will do," and offers within half a crown of the pig's value, the seller replies that he can refuse him nothing, and names half a crown above its value. The difference is split, the pig is sold, and in the quiet soul of each runs the peace of something accomplished. Thus do we buy a pig, or land, or labor, or malt, or lime, always with elaboration and set forms. And many a London man has paid double and more for his violence and his greedy haste and very unchivalrous higgling. As happened with the land at Underwalton, which the mortgagees had begged and implored the estate to take at 1200, and had privately offered to all the world at 1000, but with a sharp direct man of the kind that makes great fortunes, a man in a motor car, a man in a fur coat, a man of few words, bought for 2300 before my very eyes, protesting that they might take his offer or leave it, and all because he did not begin by praising the land. Well, then, this man I spoke of offered to help me, and he went to get his scythe. But I went into this house and brought out a gallon jar of small ale for him and for me, for the sun was now very warm, and small ale goes well with mowing. When we had drunk some of this ale in mugs, called I see you, we took each a swathe, he a little behind me because he was the better mower, and so for many hours we swung, one before the other, mowing and mowing at the tall grass of the field. And the sun rose to noon, and we were still at our mowing, and we ate food, but only for a little while, and we took again to our mowing. And at last there was nothing left but a small square of grass, standing like a square of linesmen who keep their formation, tall and unbroken, with all the dead lying around them when the battle is over and done. Then for some little time I rested after all those hours, and the man and I talked together, and a long way off we heard in another field the musical sharpening of a scythe. The sunlight slanted, powdered and mellow, over the breadth of the valley, for day was nearing its end. I went to fetch rakes from the steading, and when I had come back the last of the grass had fallen, and all the field lay flat and smooth, with a very green short grass in lanes between the dead and yellow swathes. These swathes we raked into cocks to keep them from the dew against our return at daybreak, and we made the cocks as tall and steep as we could, for in that shape they best keep off the dew, and it is easier also to spread them after the sun has risen. Then we raked up every straggling blade until the whole field was a clean floor, for the tedding and the carrying of the hay next morning. The grass we had mown was but a little over 2 acres, for that is all the pasture on my little tiny farm. When we had done all this, there fell upon us the beneficent and deliberate evening, so that, as we sat a little while together near the rakes, we saw the valley more solemn and dim around us, and all the trees and hedgerows quite still, and held by a complete silence. Then I paid my companion his wage, and bade him a good night, till we should meet in the same place before sunrise. He went off with a slow and steady progress, as all our peasants do, making their walking a part of the easy but continual labor of their lives. But I sat on, watching the light creep around towards the north and change, and the waning moon coming up as though by stealth behind the woods of No Man's Land. End of Essay 11.